Hi, it's James from Cowboy 43 Productions here, and I'm making a promotional video for my blog post that I ended up writing, where I share some of my thoughts on atheism. Well, what is atheism? So, atheism is best described as the belief that there is no God. The atheist person lacks belief in any God, gods, or deities. And by that extension, they also probably lack belief in any supernatural realm, at least without sufficient evidence. So in the worldview of the atheist person, the world around us is just categorized as a physical, material world.
The view I take about free will is that of course we have free will because we have no choice but to have it. I was, and to some extent, and I still to some extent am a dialectical materialist, and I also think there are some ironies in the universe as well as in history. But to say, of course we have free will, the boss says we've got it, is to make a mockery of the whole concept. And it's also to invite the question, what kind of tyranny is this that you want? You want an all-supervising, all-deciding person. I ask you first, what sources of information do you have about this person's existence that I don't have, that are denied to me? I'd like to know. And second, why do you want it? Why do you want to arrive at a terminus of unfreedom, where there is a celestial authority upon whom all things depend and from which all things flow? Why do you want that, and how on earth do you know that there's any case to be made for its existence?
You will actually find that many atheists are more like agnostics. They know there's something more out there, but they're just uncertain about all of the details. You know, there's good evidence for God, and there's also really good evidence that there is no God, that cause and effect relationship.
So there are lots of different types of agnostics. One type of agnostic is where the evidential scales by their lights are balanced, but that's because zero on both sides. You know, it's like there aren't positive reasons favoring either side, and because of that, or they don't see good arguments on either side, and because of that, they remain agnostic. There's another kind of agnostic which thinks that there are two ginormous towers of evidence on both sides. And that is the reason why they're agnostic, because they see that there is evidence for both sides, and they see that either that evidence is incommensurable, or it's roughly equivalent, or it's really indeterminate, it's difficult to tell. That kind of agnostic does make and defend arguments for and against, let's say, God's existence, right? Because they do think they have erected this barrier here, or this tower, we could say, in favor of atheism, and a tower in favor of theism. And at least for me, I actually fall into that latter camp of agnostics.
You know, I don't see God. Would you see God? You know, all I see is me alone in a room talking to myself. And some people are agnostic atheists.
I didn't have any belief in any gods, but I didn't assert that I knew that there was no God. I didn't think it was knowable, at least in my situation. What I found very quickly was the term agnostic atheist.
The agnostic atheist person says they'd be definitely open to the possibility of God. They just haven't found anything that they really consider sufficient evidence. So they've looked, they've studied, they've prayed, they've done all these different things, and they just haven't found any good evidence that God exists. And so to them, it's safer to say that there is no God. So many people are theists. They believe in a God. You know, they have a God that they worship. They have a faith dynamic. They have a faith that they actively practice.
Within Western culture in general, it gets even more complicated. And it's funny because, especially in American media and politics and so on, the word God gets brought up quite a lot. And the general assumption is we all know what we're talking about when we use that word, or that we're all talking about the same being or the same thing. I think we need to begin to discipline our thinking and to think carefully and intentionally about who we are referring to when we hear this word. And another major factor, you know, we all come to our definition or what we understand this word to refer to by lots of different things. We talked about those last week, by our family of origins, by our experiences growing up, and so on. Another major factor, at least for cities, especially in the West, is the fact that over the last 50 years or so, with increased immigration and mobility, the world's urban centers have become what America was 200 years ago, i.e. the melting pot. And so, odds are if you were born in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and you grew up in a city that you grew up knowing and just like have neighbors and school friends and so on, people of different ethnic or cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and that you had a very different experience that way than your grandparents did. Our cities are much more diverse. And so you have a Chinese Buddhist, or you have a Catholic from South America or something, from Costa Rica, and you have a Hindu from India, and then you have you wherever you happen to grow up, and people learn English and what all these different religious backgrounds and so on, and we have one word to talk about God.
Or they just believe in God in general. Some people are, deists, where they believe that there is a God, but they just don't believe that the God is aware of us. The God is more of a creator of some sort, but it's just so far back, it's so detached from us that it just can't see us. Are we all atheists? So the famous atheist scientist Richard Dawkins has argued over the years that we're all atheists, since we all have gods that we just don't believe in. I don't think we are all atheists. I would say we all are believers in something. The theist has a God that they believe in, even though they might consider that all the other gods out there are false idols, false deities. So why take a look at atheism?
Once you leave the ship, you're on your own.
Understood.
In his book, The God Delusion, author Richard Dawkins argues that by following a religion, people are being led astray from the truth offered by science and reason.
And as a scientist and as an educator, I like the idea that we believe things because there's evidence. There's such a lot of evidence available now at the beginning of the 21st century that it's a real shame, it's a tragedy to base your life upon something for which there is no evidence and never was any evidence, when the real truth is so wonderful.
Well, I suspect that the argument they would make is that because it's absurd, that's why it's faith, right? That if it was evidentiary, you would require no faith and it would be fact, and that would be missing the point of religion.
That's absolutely right, but that's not a point in its favor, is it?
Well, it's whatever gets you through the night, isn't it, ultimately?
Well, no, I mean, for me, what matters is the truth.
The scientific truth.
What other truth is there when we're talking about the universe, when we're talking about the nature of life? Of course, there are other sorts of truths like moral truths, or maybe they're not truths at all, but they are not scientific. I think if we're talking about the universe, about what reality is, about what life is, then truth means scientific truth. Yes.
On the other side of the coin, in his book The Deluded Atheist, a response to Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, author Douglas Wilson responds to the claims made by Dawkins, saying theists are not delusional for their God belief.
This would be a wonderful time for Dawkins to go on to explain how Charles Darwin was inconsistent with the fundamental premise of human evolution. If you've got people evolving up from primates, and if you assume a standard at all, which is another problem, then why can't one branch of humanity get ahead of another branch of humanity? Of course, creationists, those rubes and cornpones who believe that God created us, placed our first parents in the Garden of Eden, and that all of us are cousins descended from that first man and first woman, we have no problem accepting the basic equality of dignity of all human beings. But for evolutionists, Darwin was far more consistent than Dawkins is being.
I like to say that God is very personal to me, but I'm very open to science and history and reason. And who knows, maybe even I'll become an atheist. In today's world, there are many theists who reject science and even basic health care. Healthy skepticism is often important. So, what is the history behind atheism? In her book, A History of God, author Karen Armstrong argues that we as humans are not just Homo sapiens, we are also Homo religious, and the concept of God has been with us since the beginning. On the other hand, in a YouTube presentation titled The First Atheist, Diagoras of Melos, creator Steve Shives argues the first humans were probably atheists before the first gods were thought up. However, Diagoras was a man who lived around 500 BC during the times of the Greek Empire, and he was regarded as an atheist as he was one of the first people to openly criticize the existence of the Greek gods. So in the end, it appears that Diagoras was probably on the right track, as the Greek gods were later phased out with the spread of Christianity. Goodbye, Greek gods. We're gonna miss you. You can actually read about Diagoras in the book Diagoras of Melos, a contribution to the history of ancient atheism by Marek, Winiarczyk. I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry. So this is most likely where the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins gets his definition of atheism. We have a God that we believe in, but we're also atheists because we don't believe in certain gods. And then some of us just take it a step further. We don't believe in any gods. God of the impossible, my foot. So, sometime after the emergence of Jesus Christ and his ministry, the Apostle John had his disciple Polycarp, who was later martyred for teaching about Jesus.
Polycarp was asked to show a sign of Roman patriotism, in a sense, by publicly declaring his allegiance to Caesar. To the Romans, this didn't seem like a big deal, but for Polycarp, it looked like a compromise of his allegiance to Christ. Because of this dispute, Christians in the ancient world were occasionally given a strange nickname. They were sometimes called atheists, not because the Christians didn't believe in a god, but because they didn't believe in the Roman gods, the gods that mattered. Polycarp was brought out into a stadium, and the Romans sought to make an example of him. He was again asked before a jeering crowd to swear his allegiance to Caesar, and in addition to that, to denounce the atheists, by which was meant the Christians. But in an ironic twist, Polycarp cocks his head back, looks to the heavens, and then points to the crowd and says, "No, away with you, the real atheists."
His assertions later came true, actually, as Christianity later became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire.
So I think the question isn't where did these criticisms come from, but why did some people start to find them compelling? And to answer that question, I think we need not an intellectual or a philosophical history of atheism, but an emotional history.
In a lecture by Professor Alec Ryrie at Gresham College, titled Atheism in Medieval Europe, Ryrie looks at how, in the medieval world, philosophers began to think outside the box.
Richard asked for ones who managed to avoid getting burned. Here's one. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Germany, Italy, and Jerusalem. Possibly the most powerful ruler at any point in medieval Europe. And according to Pope Gregory IX, an unbeliever. In 1239, the Pope accused Frederick of calling Moses, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad charlatans and deceivers, who between them had fooled the entire world. Accused him of scoffing at the notion that a virgin could give birth to the God who created nature, and of maintaining that one should accept as truth only that which is proved by force of reason. Now, these charges are certainly exaggerated, but it is true that Frederick had been asking his favourite scholars some alarming questions. Where is God? Where are heaven, hell, and purgatory? What is beyond heaven? What is the soul? Is it immortal? If so, why do the dead never return? Rumour had it that one of Frederick's scholars, Piero della Vigna, had suggested to Frederick that Moses, Christ, and Muhammad were frauds, and had indeed written a book arguing that case under the title of The Three Impostors. It's important to be clear that this book never existed, but it became notorious on the basis of that wickedly alluring title alone. For nearly 5 centuries, dreadful tales of this book were whispered. Eccentrics, troublemakers hunted for it. A Swedish princess offered a substantial bounty for anyone who could bring her a copy. Plenty of people meet someone who has met someone who has once seen a copy of the book. Nobody manages to get any closer. Finally, in the 18th century, some enterprising French atheists actually write a book to go with the fearsome title. I mean, inevitably, it's an anticlimax. If we want to understand unbelief in the Middle Ages, I think Of the Three Impostors is a good place to start. Like medieval unbelief itself, the book existed in the imagination. It's a rumour, not a manifesto. It's an inarticulate suspicion, not a philosophical program. That's what makes it powerful.
And the common people began to feel they were being swindled by religion. The arguments led to the term atheist coming about in society.
In one sense, this is obviously true, in the sense that the Greek word atheos, whose meaning is more like godless or impious than claiming that there is no God, that word doesn't make its way into Latin until 1501, and not into European vernaculars until later on. The word atheist first appears in English in 1553. But behind that semantic point sits a more serious issue. that when medieval and early modern Europeans talked about atheism or unbelief, those words had a much wider range of meaning than they do for us now. As well as actual denials of God, they include what was sometimes called practical atheism. That is, living as if you do not believe there is a God, even if you claim that you do believe.
Ryrie compares these atheists to modern-day flat earthers, minority groups looking to expose the truth. In a lecture by Professor Alec Ryrie at Gresham College titled Jesus, Hitler, and the Abolition of God, Ryrie looks at how skeptics have fought religion using ridicule and mockery, so that they have not had to argue whether it is true or not.
But you don't play jokes like that unless you think they're funny. At the very least, you want your audience to laugh rather than to be outraged, and very likely you want them to wonder, if only for a moment, whether you're right. Of course, spoofing religion has remained a constant theme of unbelief down to the present. Monty Python, of course, the incomparable Father Ted. More merry absurdism and gentle ridicule than vicious satire. But there are, in these sorts of things, occasional flashes of real anger. And as ever, the primary target of that anger isn't God himself. It's his earthly representatives. The bitterness about priests that we've been tracing since the Middle Ages remains alive and well, and not everybody finds it funny. Voltaire took the clergy as the real target of his anger. The same mood is even plainer in Tom Paine's The Age of Reason. This is the first authentic anti-Christian bestseller. It's a book that's said to have triggered Bible-burning parties on both sides of the Atlantic. Paine's fury is directed not at God, but at churches, which he calls human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. I don't believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, the Roman church, the Greek church, the Turkish church, the Protestant church, nor any church I know of. My own mind is my own church. That's not a metaphysical position. And in fact, beneath it all, Paine's substantial religious views are surprisingly conventional. What that is, as befits one of the heralds of the American Revolution, is a declaration of independence. And it's absolutely in line with the angry unbelief that we've seen over the preceding centuries.
So as Ryrie explains, an abundance of material on Jesus was produced during this time period, including a claim that Jesus never even existed.
Now, historically speaking, this claim is not impossible, but it's pretty implausible. In effect, it requires the existence of a large-scale, entirely successful and oddly pointless conspiracy in the first century. But it's not, and it never has been, intended as a sober historical claim. Napoleon, who is recorded as denying Jesus' existence on several occasions, was not a scholar of ancient history. He simply had one of the modern era's most colossal egos, and he resented kowtowing to the moral authority of a dead Galilean peasant. The case was made more substantially by Karl Marx's scholarly mentor Bruno Bauer, maybe the most serious historian ever to deny Jesus' existence. And for him, he does it because it fits with his long-standing anti-Christian views and also with his anti-Semitism, which balked at putting a Jewish prophet at the heart of Western civilization. In our own times, Jesus denialism has found a more harmless home on the fringes of some atheist subcultures. So books like these don't disguise the fact that they are anti-religious polemics or simple contrarianism rather than scholarly historical studies. What makes the determined pursuit of this argument interesting is not just that it's implausible, but that it's logically unnecessary. After all, denials of Christianity don't become any weaker if you admit that Jesus Christ existed, any more than denials of life on Mars become weaker if you admit that Mars exists. This fringe are following Napoleon by recognizing that Christianity's cultural power depends less on any philosophical or theological claim than on the moral authority attached to the figure of Jesus. The more level-headed advocates of atheism have preferred to avoid engaging with the figure of Jesus at all. An unusual exception is the novelist Philip Pullman, whose 2010 book, The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ, is an engaging fictionalized separation of the good ethical Jesus from his bad religious alter ego. I think this is the distinction that Spinoza would have recognized. So even in our own times, the moral authority of Jesus of Nazareth is a force to be reckoned with. Rather than critiquing or relativizing those morals, Christianity's opponents generally feel obliged to avoid him, to co-opt him by claiming his ethical mantle, or in extremis to abolish him. So, the Western world's wrestling match between belief and unbelief has been a long one. Both parties have made numerous premature declarations of victory or of defeat, but this is a struggle whose course has repeatedly proved unpredictable, and there is no knowing how things will turn out next.
Ryrie later compares Jesus Christ to Adolf Hitler, as Jesus is seen as representing the very best in humanity, and Hitler and his Nazis are seen as representing the very worst in humanity. In an episode of Closer to Truth, host Robert Kuhn asks the question, what is the new atheism?
It's a movement to try to say, look, there's a lot more of us out there than you think. You're not alone, and that it's not okay to say that we're not as moral as you, or that we're not good citizens, or that we can't lead fulfilling lives. Stop saying that. So basically, it's a consciousness-raising, civil liberties kind of movement. I mean, you can be a black, gay woman Muslim president before an atheist would get elected as a white male. Right. I mean, that's how bad it is.
Right. Well, skeptic Michael Shermer says the new atheism is the modern social and political movement of the atheist ideology. Shermer says the leadership wants its members to have confidence in pursuit of theists. Theist Alistair McGrath says many atheists are surprised that religion has persisted as long as it has.
I think that there are a number of things involved here. One of them clearly is there is a cultural battle going on for influence between science and religion, and these are seen as being two very significant forces. But alongside that, there's another development that very often doesn't get the credit it deserves, and that is that back in the 1960s, everyone thought religion was on its way out. And I think in many ways, the resurgence of religion in most parts of the world actually has taken people by surprise, and there are some people who are angry about it. Why has this come back when it should be dead? And it's not simply an inconvenience. We don't like religion, so we need to critique it. It's much more a fear that the theories that predicted that religion would disappear might be wrong. Atheism's always been around, but there's a new kind of atheism, which I think is really characterized by its shrillness, its aggressiveness.
Philosopher Keith Ward does not like the new atheism, as he feels it downplays the study of philosophy and the role of philosophy in society.
So what I don't like is that they take materialistic views for granted. And then, secondly, I don't like the fact they don't think that questions about God are philosophical questions at all. They think they're just stupid. And some people are mad, and so they believe in God.
The new atheists reject the philosophical arguments or ridicule them. Those same philosophical arguments for God are largely rejected by even philosophers of religion. So what's the difference?
The difference is you've got serious debate about it.
Okay.
And it is possible for me, for example, to be accepted as a serious philosopher, really, on the whole, and still believe in God. Now, there may be some element of surprise in some quarters of that, but it's still possible. And if you look at the history of philosophy, it's just a fact that the vast majority of major, famous philosophers have believed in God.
So that is certainly true through history, but as science has continued to explain questions in physics and in biology, that the percentage of philosophers over time who believe in God has continuously shrunk.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. It's a pity, really.
Philosopher Anthony Grayling says there is nothing new about the movement. He tells us the word atheist was a Greek term used to refer to a person who does not buy into the established situation.
People take it to imply hostility to religion or... in fact, what the atheist is really saying is that the onus is on the theist. That if somebody is going to assert something or going to take a particular view about the nature and contents of the universe, they've got to make a case for it. It's no good just appealing to history and what people believed in the past, because they believed all sorts of things in the past, the vast majority of which have been subsequently superseded.
So I have a small confession to make. I'm a theist. I believe in God. My faith is in the God of Israel.
Say what?
So this is what my father found.
So, my testimony is one of brokenness and doubt. So I've had a little bit of both in my life. I think we all have. I grew up in a Catholic family that only went to church probably once in a while. I think I have a few childhood memories of going to church and being in church, but not a whole lot. I was friends with the pastor's kids, and in middle school, the pastor, he invited me to attend youth group. I showed up to youth group as a kid who was doubtful and angry with God. You know, I really didn't go to church very often growing up. I probably held God at the same standards as Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. To this day, I'm probably the most religious person in my family. I was just very hesitant about showing up to church. I had all these anxieties that followed me throughout high school and even into college. I felt that at the time, the youth leaders were asking me to get into this belief box. I had a lot of questions that no one could really answer. Why do you want me to get into the box? What's going to happen when I get into the box? One of my youth leaders would comment later on down the road as I'm graduating high school. When I first started showing up to youth group, I just had all these questions, and the leader didn't know if I was serious or not. And they later figured out that I was serious. My experiences in youth group were what led me to faith. I was one of the few kids in my youth group that didn't really grow up in the church. And I'm sorry to say, a couple of years down the line, I think I'm one of the few people from my youth group who really is still a believer. I didn't grow up in an atheist household. I have a pastor who sure did. I would definitely say growing up with my father, though, my father is a bit of a naysayer on the Bible. He's a bit of a critical thinker. And then a couple of my father's friends are also like that. They're naysayers on the Bible. They're just very critical thinkers. They see all the contradictions, as I could say, and all the different parts that just don't add up to this bigger story. So I think that's definitely where I got some of my doubt from, some of my attitude, some of my ability to question from. I got it from them. I was mean. I was just so mean when I was asking these questions to some of my church pastors and my youth leaders. Like, what's going on here? Who is this kid? So for me, with my circumstance, I was a young kid. I was a teenager. And I had a sense of spirituality, the spiritual realm. But I wasn't a Christian. I didn't believe in God in that way, at least not right away. And I think part of it was I was struggling with brokenness. I had a lot of problems at home. I just had a lot in on my plate at the time. I didn't see God in the midst of that, of course. So belief is something that we wrestle with. I was talking to a guy I had met about faith, and I said, imagine you walk into a room or something and there's all these people in there and they're worshiping some sort of a creepy shrine. And they're like, oh, come on over here, worship the shrine with us. And you're like, oh, wow, this is pretty crazy. This is a lot to wrap my mind around. Well, let me prick your finger or something and then put some blood on the shrine or whatever. And I was telling this to the guy and he was like, yeah, that actually sounds kind of creepy. Sometimes as theists, we have to understand and we have to be able to relate to people who don't have belief, who don't understand what it is we're talking about. And that's a whole world out there. That's a whole secular world full of all different ideas. I found a good community that really seemed to genuinely care for me, even help me with some of my brokenness and have some of the answers that I was looking for. Some of my experiences in youth group were very personal to me. And one thing led to another, and I was baptized. And I started on this faith walk, and I did a lot of volunteering through, middle school and high school, and even into college.